Welcome to everybody. I'm Tim Taylor with the Sacramento Clean Cities Coalition. We appreciate you participating today, and on behalf of both the Sacramento Clean Cities Coalition, the Long Beach Clean Cities Coalition, and the East Bay Clean Cities Coalition, we're very happy to be able to present this webinar on natural gas drivetrains, specifying and maintaining natural gas engines and drivetrains. Before we jump straight to the presentation, I want to say thank you very much to the sponsors, the Sacramento Clean Cities sponsors, that help us keep the process of educating fleet managers and others about various low emission and zero emission and alternative fuels technologies. And with that, I want to say we'll jump right to the presentation and introduce Tom Swenson, Business Development Manager with Cummins, and Jason Bauer, Technical Support Manager with Cummins. And so Tom and Jason, I'm gonna mute myself and take myself off the camera and turn it over to you guys.
All right, great. Thank you, Tim. Again, my name is Tom Swenson, and I'm joined by my colleague and technical expert, Jason Bauer. Thanks for joining this discussion of best practices to maintain heavy-duty natural gas engines. Jason and I are both part of the natural gas team at Cummins. So basically what we're going to do today, the format today, is to go through a few slides to kind of do an overview on key maintenance practices. But we also want this to be interactive and respond to audience questions or concerns. And so if you've got those, as Chris described, just use the Q&A feature. We'll do our best to monitor during the session, but we plan to leave time at the end to make sure that we, if there's something we can't get to during the discussion, that we get to it at the end. So feel free to offer any comments or questions. Just to kind of get us started, we've got a quick pop-up survey, which Chris has kindly put up for us. So if folks could just take a moment and fill that out and click reply, that would be fantastic. We're just trying to kind of get a sense of who you are and whether or not you've got natural gas vehicles in your operation. And while you're doing that, I will also let folks know that we offer a couple of monthly email newsletters. They're absolutely free. And so the two are natural gas engine and alternative news, and it's kind of what's going on with natural gas engines and other alternatives. And then one that's more related to kind of what we're talking about today is natural gas engine tech talk. And Jason pulls that together basically on a monthly basis. So every once in a while we miss a month, but what he does is he kind of highlights a maintenance issue or some experience issue that we've seen in fleets. And we're absolutely happy to add you to that newsletter, one or both. And if you want to, just send me an email at tom.swenson@cummins.com, and I'd be happy to get you signed up for one or both of those. So it looks like we've got government, but mostly public fleet, and you already own natural gas vehicles. So that's fantastic. So that's great. Those are the kind of folks that we're targeting. So I'm glad you're able to join us today. So before we jump into the tech piece, I just wanted to spend just a minute on the portfolio, just kind of to frame what we're talking about here. So we've got three engines, our B6.7, our L9N, and our ISX12N, and that kind of covers everything from like a straight box truck on the, for the 6.7, the L9s in transit, refuse, vocational applications, maybe some light class 7 kind of stuff. And then, in tractor applications up to 80,000 pounds are 12N, which is our 12-liter product. All three of these are now certified to the CARB optional low NOx standard of 0.02 for NOx, grams per brake horsepower. and they can use renewable natural gas, traditional fossil, compressed natural gas, or liquid natural gas. And what we found is if you're using renewables, we're getting depending on the feedstock, it's 70 to greater than 300%. So carbon negative reduction in greenhouse gas, which I know is a big focus for many folks. And then just relative to where they're made, the 6, 7, and the 9 are both built in our Rocky Mount, North Carolina plant, and the 12-liter comes out of Jamestown, New York. So if you ever wanted to get a plant tour, once we can resume those, we would be happy to get you into that cycle. You just, again, let me know, tom.swenson@cummins.com, and we can get you on the list so that when we're allowed to bring visitors back in, that you're on the list. Okay, so now let's turn it over to Jason, and Jason and I are going to kind of have a conversation about various components of maintenance and parts and practices and those sorts of things. And so we thought it would be great to cover kind of things that we found important for fleets to follow. So Jason, with that, I'll let you take it away.
Hey, thanks, Tom. So to start off, we wanted to touch on some of the best practices we've learned over the years and years of working with customers and producing these engines. And some of these are going to seem really obvious, but there's some little things to them that have made it, I guess, not so obvious. And working closely with fleets, we've zeroed in on how to dial it in. But the biggest first bullet point here is perform maintenance on time. And we add the caveat time based on engine hour intervals. We struggled a lot. We found a lot of customers struggling with mileage intervals. So oil changes at 20,000 miles or 30,000 miles, whatever is published for your specific vehicle. But really, it's when the engine's running that we're actually using consumables. We're degrading the oil as the engine runs. Even if the truck doesn't move or the bus doesn't move, the oil is seeing heat. Same for spark plugs. They're sparking. They're eroding themselves every time the spark plug sparks. Not necessarily when the truck or unit just moves. So we've pushed to go to an hour-based interval for all the natural gas units, and we know that isn't necessarily easy to do it for most fleets. And so when we get into that, we want to at least look at what the average speed is for the different duty cycles that your fleet may see. A lot of fleets will have mixed usage. Some run more highway, or some run more stop and go. So just understanding the duty cycle of your specific fleet to get an average vehicle speed, and then it's simply just multiplying that by the hours interval that we've given to come up with when it really should be done. It's amazing the difference we have just by adjusting our intervals to be accurate. Secondly, keeping idle to a minimum. Again, when your engine's idling, it's not doing any work really, other than maybe powering lights, running an AC compressor, that kind of stuff. It's not really doing much work, but we're using the engine still. We're using up spark plugs and oil and air filters. We're loading all that stuff up even when we're not moving. So we just say keep it to a minimum if we can. And we realize not everybody can. We realize there are instances where you do need to idle the engine, and that's fine. It's just a general guideline. Third, use genuine Cummins parts. And it's not just because we're trying to make money off the parts. It's not that at all. But the parts that we sell for the engines have been validated to work on our engines, and they meet the standards to keep the emissions of the engines meeting certification. All these aftermarket suppliers, they can't afford to test their components at an emissions level to prove it still meets an emissions level. We go through and rigorously test because we are responsible for meeting that emissions level throughout the life of the engine. So as long as you're using Cummins genuine parts, you can be confident you're hitting that emissions certification still. Fourth, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but use CES 20092 spec oil to take advantage of a longer drain interval. So CES means Cummins engine standard. So it's just an internal standard we have. That's the spec number for a fluid or an oil that we recommend for natural gas engines. And so using the latest oil, using the current spec oil, you get to take advantage of a longer drain interval in your fleet. And then I also recommend add a spark plug change, check for and potentially install the latest calibration in your ECM. Historically, we release new calibrations at least twice a year for a current product and legacy product as well. We're always finding ways to improve that can be as simple as putting a calibration in. It takes 15 to 20 minutes only. It can be done easily when a spark plug change is being done. You plug the computer in, hook it up, and let the computer work while your technician's changing the spark plugs. It's a win-win. It's simple, and you get the latest version of the ECM calibration. And then finally, if equipped, drain the low pressure fuel filters every day. I say if equipped because the new 12-liter doesn't necessarily have them, but all the other products do. And I've seen numerous fleets that have had drivers miss draining filters, and then the compressor oil gets into the fuel system on the truck, into the engine, and we're talking a multi-$1,000 repair just because they didn't drain the filter every day. I know not every day they're going to get stuff out of them, but having that habit protects the engine tremendously and can reduce downtime, performance issues, and obviously avoid the expensive repairs.
Yeah, that's a great overview, Jason. Sort of speaking to the point around sort of the simple things, or maybe this may seem simple. One of the things that we've run into on these engines is simply just sort of checking the oil, what the process is to check the oil, when to add, and then probably most critically, how much to add.
Yeah.
Let's, I'll move to the next slide, but can you talk some about just the simple process of checking the oil?
Yeah, definitely. This is something that comes up, and it's another one of them simple things that everybody thinks they know how to do. And me as a technical person, I thought I knew how to do it, but you dig into it, and it's a couple little things that become obvious when you point them out to me, when I put them out to people, but you don't necessarily think about. But the first one is make sure the vehicle is parked on level ground. A couple degrees of difference can change the reading on a dipstick by 2 to 4 millimeters. That can be a half gallon of oil just by a couple degrees of unlevelness for the vehicle. Then definitely let the oil drain back to the pan. If you shut an engine down and check it right away, or check it while it's running, and don't let it stabilize, we've seen it off by a gallon. So giving 15 or more minutes for the oil to drain back to the pan, to get out of the upper part of the engine and get back down to the pan where we're actually measuring it, can greatly impact what your reading is going to be. So it's kind of crazy that it takes that long, but it really does. And then make sure the dipstick is fully inserted and locked. These got a quarter turn twist on them, so we want to get it all the way in there and locked, and then pulled back out to make sure we're getting it an accurate reading. And then only add if we're at the add mark or below the add mark, because we know it can vary so much based on when you're measuring it, when you're checking it, and how hot the engine is, how hot the oil is. We have that range for a reason. So if we're adding when we're within the acceptable range, we're likely going to overfill the engine. So only add oil when it's below the add mark. And when you're below the add mark, you should be adding a set amount. You shouldn't just be adding trying to get to full, but we should add like for the 12 liter, we should add 2 gallons and leave it at that. We should be back into the acceptable range at least. We're not going for full. We're just going for it filled up. 9 liters, it's roughly a gallon that you would add, and the 6, 7, a half gallon. So if you have a driver saying, well, he had to add a quart, well, that should never be the answer that you're putting in. It should never be a quart. It should be a half gallon that they have added, or for the larger engine, it should be a gallon or 2. If we're looking at just quarts and small numbers, we know we're not doing it right. And the big problem here is overfilling it can drive oil consumption up. And so then you're just chasing it. So if you're constantly overfilling it, you're constantly going to be consuming it as well. So you'll think you have a problem. So as long as the oil level is between the full and add marks, oil should not be added at all. I know that's not intuitive necessarily to drivers. They want to make sure they've got their engine full of oil so they don't have issues, and I get it. But really, the way the system is designed, as long as we're within the acceptable range, we don't touch it at all.
Yeah, as you noted, that was a real, and frankly, I still struggle with it, even in my personal vehicles. There's this just desire to want it to be full, but really, you just want it to be in that range. Right. And we've chased some oil consumption complaints that turned out to be just simply overfilling, because they were trying to top off and get to that perfect fill mark, when in reality, really, you probably want it right kind of dead in the middle, is where you want it to live. So, yeah. So that's fantastic. Let's just dive into oil consumption a little more. So, besides overfilling, what are some of the other things that can drive oil consumption?
Okay, so oil consumption in general, it's just hard to quantify. That's, we've put together forms to help quantify it, but really it can't be just a driver saying, hey, I'm always having to add oil. We need to document it better. So we need to, make sure we're looking at recording the mileage and the amount of oil that's added over numerous adds. So this should be, over 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 miles that we're measuring how much oil we're adding. And again, we shouldn't be adding a quart or half a quart, or I had to add half a bottle of oil. It's really, it should be 2 quarts or 4 quarts gallons depending on what platform we're talking about. And we need to make sure we're doing the exact same way each time too. So the same person measuring and documenting how much oil they've added, just so we know the process is consistent. But, beyond just overfilling, almost everybody blames, well, it's the bad rings or it's the piston, it's consuming oil, it's burning the oil. And really it can be many things. One, we've obviously talked about the overfilled crankcase. It could be an incorrect dipstick. So the dipstick could be too long or too short, causing a wrong measurement. We have seen that in the past. The OEMs can order a dipstick based on how the engine is installed in the engine, and sometimes that isn't right. So we've had to fix that. We've seen external leaks or internal leaks causing oil consumption. The crankcase breather system can pass oil if it's not maintained correctly. And then obviously the turbocharger is lubricated with engine oil, so if the seals go bad in it, it can burn oil that way. Worn out rings, it does happen. As engines get old, they do wear out. So worn rings can cause oil consumption, but they're not the usual cause of it. On our natural gas engines, we're not usually seeing worn rings early life causing oil consumption. Or we could see assembly errors. Being that these engines are made at the same plant as the diesel counterparts, occasionally, and it's very rare, but it does happen, we'll get a diesel ring in a natural gas engine. They do fit. They can go in the ring groove, but they don't seal the way they're supposed to. They are not compatible, so it does happen. But we don't necessarily just blame worn out rings or bad power cylinder design just because we have oil consumption. There's a whole lot that goes into it. And we're happy to work with you to try to understand where the oil is going or why you're sensing oil consumption. But it is a a process. It's not just a matter of sending a truck to a dealer or distributor and saying, hey, it's consuming oil, fix it. It's a big process to truly understand where it's going and if it's really going anywhere.
Yeah, and to your point about helping, we've got a form that we provide for the driver to fill out, and it's a daily. It should be part of their daily walk around anyway.
Right.
And we actually have them mark on the dipstick where the oil level is, and we found that to be really helpful to get our hands around. Is there really an oil consumption problem, and then if there is, sort of how bad is it? So just to reinforce what Jason said, don't be shy about reaching out if you think there's something going on. We're glad to help. So Jason, you had mentioned that we've got an oil spec of called CES 2092. Can we spend just a little bit of time on why that particular spec is important?
Yeah. Back end of 2019, we introduced a new spec, the 20,092 spec. Before that, it was 20,085, and prior to that, it was 20,074. All three were the Cummins recommended natural gas engine oil for that time frame. With the 20,092 oil, we've really focused on getting longevity out of the oil and optimizing the oil for natural gas. Prior to that, it really was just an oil that we thought was working. We tested with it, but we knew there was room for improvement. So the new 20,092 oil is a whole lot more robust to living in a natural gas engine. It can handle the heat better. It's more resistant to oxidation. Overall, it really is a much better oil. And as we go into oil change intervals, oil drain intervals, you'll see we can at least double oil drain intervals with the 20,092 oil versus the older specs. So that's the big reason why we're going to 20,092. We know it's a more robust oil. It gives us a lot of margin for oil changes, and we know it doesn't go bad fast. So overheating the oil, it's more resistant to being overheated and doesn't get acidic quickly.
Yeah, I'm starting to feel like we're a Valvoline commercial here at the moment, but I mean,
yes.
I hope folks are kind of getting the sense that using the right oil and changing it on time is a big darn deal. And the Cummins and Valvoline have worked together for years to develop better engine oils, and recently Valvoline actually came out with a second gen version of their premium one solution, which I think is just furthers the advantages. And I think we're going to get into this in more detail in a couple more slides on specific maintenance. But maybe just a quick plug on the second generation.
Yeah, the Gen 2 oil, and you're right, we've been partnering with Valvoline for a long time, and so it does seem like we're a Valvoline commercial, and we're not intending to be. But all our development, all our testing work is always done with the Valvoline oils. So they've been a big partner with us for a long time. And that's why we not necessarily push it. As long as you're using an oil that meets our spec, we're okay with it. We recommend the Valvoline because we have all the experience with Valvoline. So all the endurance testing, all the abusive testing we do prior to engine launch is done with the Valvoline product. So we do have all the experience to say, hey, using the Valvoline at this interval, your engine should last. So with the one solution Gen 2 for the 9-liter product, so the ISLG, and then the current product, the L9N, you can take your oil drain interval to 1,500 hours, which is 3 times what it would have been with the 20,085 oil, or 50% longer than any of the other CES 20,092 oils. So only with the Valvoline Gen 2 can you go to a 1,500 hour. You get that extra 500 hours with your oils.
Yeah, and extending the ODI, I mean, it not only does it save money, but it saves disposal and just reduces our sort of footprint, right? Our environmental footprint on having to go through more oil. which is a great segue into, we need to there are some other things besides changing the oil that are important.
Yeah.
So let's go through each of those platforms and kind of go through what the maintenance cycles are, and the maintenance items and those kinds of things.
Sure. So the 12 liters, so the ISX 12G, which was prior to 2018, and then the ISX 12N, which is the 2018 and newer product. These intervals apply to both of them. But you'll see here, the oil filter is the oil and filter is the first line. So if you were using the old oil, the 20,085 oil, every 500 hours you should be changing it. And then if you go to the 20,092 oil that we recommend, it's the only oil we actually recommend anymore. But I do include the old Spec for people that still have totes of the old oil. You can go to 1,000 hours. So you doubled your oil drain interval there. The nice thing about doubling your drain interval is you line it up with your spark plugs at 1,000 hours as well. And now, just recently, we did announce if you're in a severe duty cycle, you may have to reduce your spark plug interval to 750 hours, but that isn't most fleets. It is a severe duty cycle. Overall, 1,000 hours is the average that most fleets do see for spark plugs. And then coolant filter, 1,500 hours unless you're using an extended life coolant filter. And coolant as well needs to be maintained about 6,000 hours. Another big factor in engine performance and drivability is valve adjustments. So these still have an adjustable overhead. So we do the first one at 1,000 hours, and then each additional one every 3,000 hours. So the first one would be at 1,000 hours. The second one will be at 4,000 hours. The third one at 7,000 hours. 10,000 hours, etc. That's how that math is supposed to work. And then the rest of the ignition system, we do the ignition coil extensions at 10,000 hours. So roughly half the life of an engine. We expect at least 20,000 hours out of these engines. And also the crankcase breather on the 12N at 10,000 hours. We've also included on this slide the part numbers for a lot of these components so that you have them as a quick reference.
Yeah, and before we move to the 9-liter, I know we've seen some folks changing the ignition coil extension sometimes with every spark plug change, which I guess is okay if you want to spend money, but I mean, there's no reason to change those unless they, for some reason, have gotten damaged, right?
That's correct. Yeah, I mean, at every spark plug change, we should be inspecting the coil extension and the coil. There's a procedure for testing the components as well electronically. But yeah, the extension itself should last 10,000 hours. There is a boot that comes with every spark plug kit. The boot gets changed out every spark plug change, but the extension itself should last 10,000 hours. It doesn't have to be changed every time.
Yeah, good. Okay. All right. So let's move on to the 9-liter, which looks pretty similar, but different.
It's very similar. The big differences here, you'll see the valve adjustment is at 1,000 hours, and spark plugs go to 1,500 hours. So here's where it gets really interesting using the Valvoline Gen 2 product. Your oil change can now line up with your spark plug change at 1,500 hours. So I think that's the real benefit of going to the Valvoline product Gen 2 is, again, you've lined your oil change and your spark plug change at the same point, which is, I think, a real benefit to fleets. Then everything else is roughly the same. We've given maintenance part numbers as well there. Overall, it's relatively simple and like I said, the same as the 12-liter.
All right, and then just to round it out, the 6.7.
And the 6.7, yeah, the 6.7, it does have a slightly lower interval for spark plugs and oil. The 20,092 is at 750 hours, as is the spark plugs. So they're currently lined up. If there's fleets that are interested in pushing farther, it's possible we could test with them, but at this point we don't have experience to say we can go further than that. I think there's some potential, but we don't have the actual experience with those products to know how far we can push spark plugs and oil.
Yeah.
But we are interested in working with a fleet potentially to push them just to see if there's room for pushing them out.
Right. And my understanding is that the service intervals are slightly shorter because the engine spins faster. The 6.7
Exactly.
spins a lot faster than the 9 and the 12.
Exactly. Yeah. As the engine gets
Yeah.
bigger, it spins slower. So yeah, the engine does spin faster. Is why these are lower. But there is some room. It seems when talking with engineering to potentially push these out a little bit.
Yeah.
If we have a customer that we can work with to do some testing.
Right. So we've got a question that came in relative to the interval for the coils themselves. It's not on the chart, but
yeah, you're right. It's not on the chart, and there's a reason for that. The coils should last the life of the engine. They don't sometimes, and I know customers have had to replace them in the past. A lot of this comes back to improper maintenance of spark plugs and the ignition system in general. So if the spark plug isn't changed on time, the gap grows, and as that gap grows, it requires higher voltage. That higher voltage then starts stressing the ignition coil extension, so we can burn up an extension or break down an extension that way, but also we're electrically stressing then the coil itself. So if the coil is always having to put out higher voltage, it can burn itself up and use itself up before the life of the engine is expired. So it does happen, but there is no quoted interval for it because we do expect it to last the life of the engine when the whole systems are maintained.
good. Yeah, great. And thank you for the question. And feel free, folks out there, to keep pinging us on additional things that come to mind. So hopefully we've conveyed that maintenance is a key factor for success. And not to scare folks, but maybe you could provide some examples on what could happen if the maintenance schedule isn't followed.
Yeah. So I think the next slide, we get into some of the symptoms of late maintenance, and I've gone out to fleets and visited with them, and I'll sit down and we'll start talking. Before we go into any details, we'll just start talking about what they're experiencing. And usually the first thing they talk about is misfire. We're having to change spark plugs sooner than the whatever the quoted interval was with 50,000 miles or 25,000 miles, whatever. We're having to change them early, and come to find out they're just using the number that they saw somewhere online, or the number if they were averaging 50 miles an hour, and then we find out they're driving in LA traffic. We know they're not averaging 50 miles an hour there, and so their interval is way off. So misfire being blamed on spark plugs, and where spark plugs can address the misfire, that's the first sign that, hey, wait a minute, we're not changing them on time, because we do know if you change them at the 1,000 hours for a 12 liter, you shouldn't get into a misfire. That interval has been designed to have the spark plugs changed right before they would start causing misfire. And then if you continue driving it like that, you end up having fault lamps on the dash. You have rough running. You have drivers complaining of low power, and then you're also putting unburnt fuel into the catalyst then too, and the catalyst has to deal with all the extra fuel that isn't actually being burned in the cylinder. Another symptom we see is front and rear main seal leaks on the 12 liter. The main seals coke up with oil when the oil starts to degrade. And so if the oil isn't done on time, the oil will start to oxidize and degrade and start packing in the seal. And it's not a failure of the seal, it's just the seal is overloaded with degraded oil that causes it to plug up the grooves in it that keep it from leaking. So once we start seeing main seals leak on the 12 liters, we know the oil wasn't maintained properly. And then the other scary one is piston failures on the ISX 12G. This oil breakdown, once it starts to break down, it adds deposits to the bottom side of the pistons, which is not something that anybody can see. But it causes the steel piston to overheat, and we actually crack the steel piston just because oil wasn't addressed on time. So just by dialing in the maintenance, we've been able to eliminate a lot of these failures for fleets And the ones that don't want to dial in the maintenance or don't believe us, they tend to continue to see these failures, and it's a painful conversation to have. But we do know what's causing it, unfortunately, and it's mostly maintenance. So any fleets that have seen these kind of failures need to at least revisit their maintenance intervals and make sure they're being done on time. And if the maintenance intervals seem correct and we still see these failures, it does probably require a further conversation, a deeper dive to understand what might be going on. But yeah, these are the big three that I've seen that really point to maintenance being missed.
Yeah, you know, the engine is designed to spray oil up against the backside of the piston to keep it cool.
Yeah.
And you're right. So once once that oil breaks down, and maybe that sort of brings home why we've been focused, at least in this discussion, a lot on the oil piece,
Yes.
And then working with Valvoline to try to improve it to, kind of, I guess, increase that margin of error, if you will. I remember, I'll just share a short story about Misfire. Was working with a fleet, and they were complaining about Misfire, and they had changed everything. On the ignition side, they changed the spark plugs and the coils and the extensions. I mean, they had gone through everything, and they still had Misfire. And I said, well, did you adjust the overhead?
Right.
And they said, well, no, that's not it. And I said, well, okay, but just humor me, if you could, go ahead and adjust the valves. And about a week later, they called and said the truck's running great. The valve adjustment worked. And so all of this stuff, I mean, I share this just to illustrate that all of this stuff is really intertwined. And you need to, check all the boxes to have successful operation. And where we've had success, because it's been a mixed bag of feedback. We have some fleets that come and say, man, these things they're really painful and expensive to maintain. And when we dig down into it, what we find is they're on a reactive maintenance schedule, basically. Yeah. So they're waiting for something to happen, and then they'll service it. Versus fleets that are doing it on schedule have really, indicated to us a very successful operation. So we're pleased to be able to share these kind of best practices, with folks. And I love this slide to kind of wrap it up.
Yeah.
I actually had a college roommate who was not terribly mechanically inclined, and he came home one day and said, my engine's making this awful noise. And I went out and I said, dude, you're out of oil. I mean, we pulled the dipstick and there was nothing there. So this hits particularly home for me. So at this point, that wraps up the formal presentation. I haven't seen any more questions come in via the Q&A, but we'd be thrilled to address any comments or concerns of things that we haven't covered. At this point,
I see one that had popped up in the chat window.
Yeah.
What's the expected lifetime in miles of a CNG ISX 12N engine? The 12N, it's based on the ISX 12G, so they're very, very common. The base engine is very common. So cylinder head, power cylinder bearings, all that stuff is very common. We are seeing fleets get anywhere between 800 to a million miles, 800,000 to a million miles roughly before overhaul on the 12 liters. Obviously, it's very duty cycle dependent. So these are fleets that are over the road, such as like a UPS. They can get about a million miles. Sometimes they do them a little sooner. Sometimes they try to push them. So yeah, roughly 800 to a million on that one.
I had to for you, Jason or Tom, you mentioned that at the very beginning, you talked about some fleets being interested in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. You didn't talk about any fleets that might be running on renewable natural gas where that would be an even bigger reduction in greenhouse gases. But could you talk a little bit about any fleets you're familiar with that are using renewable natural gas and whether they have any issues or whether they have been satisfied, whether that causes any engine issues, et cetera?
Well, overall, the whole renewable natural gas, it's injected into the pipeline and gas is taken out of the pipeline somewhere else. So overall, renewable gas is gas. It's natural gas. So the fleets that are using renewable, they're not seeing any difference in performance or reliability over those that are not paying for the renewable natural gas.
Yeah, and some of the probably one of the most well-known fleets that went renewable early is UPS. They made a big commitment to do that. It turns out, especially in California, renewables are already fueling about 90% of the fleet. So the fuel providers, because of the low carbon fuel standard, and there's some credits, and I'm this is about where my knowledge base on what they call LCFS kind of quits, but it makes it makes it attractive to use the renewable gas already, and so if fleets are not contracting already for renewable specifically, it's pretty likely that they're getting it anyway, because the fuel providers, have just set up their business to acquire renewable gas. And one of the things that's kind of come up relatively recently is, well, where does the gas come from? Because there was, well, I think the current thinking, still is that, as on a climate basis, you want to reduce, the atmospheric carbon, but there's been a lot of recent development in California derived renewables. And I don't remember all the legislative numbers, but there were a number of bills that were passed to basically encourage those developments. And so now we're getting renewable gas off of dairies, landfills, which has kind of been, historical source. Wastewater treatment plants are getting upgraded to capture the gas that comes off of those. Food waste, green waste. I mean, there's just a whole host now of folks that are generating natural gas, and not I've heard some folks say, well, you're generating gas that wouldn't otherwise be generated, and that's just not accurate. What we're doing is we're capturing gas that's always been generated just from normal biological processes, and we're using those as a transportation fuel. And if we really wanted to dig into this, we do have US Gain as part of the sort of standby panel, if you will, and they could really dive into that if you want to talk renewables in more detail.
Yep.
Hey, Tom, I was going to mention we are having another webinar coming up in October where we're going to talk about infrastructure, and we'll be definitely touching on the renewable aspects as far as where it's coming from, how it gets to you, the end user. So rather than derail this from, I think you did a good overview on how the renewable gas gets to you and what it's there from. But I'd suggest chiming or at least registering for that webinar, and we'll take a much deeper dive.
Yeah, great. Oh, thank you. I should have been more up to speed on the future agenda items, so appreciate Martin you jumping in and doing that. So you'll learn everything you want to know about renewables here in a future session. And Jason, I see that you saw the Q&A about the catalyst that came in.
Yeah, so we got a question. Is the life expectancy of the three-way exhaust catalyst the same as the engine? Assuming it's shorter, is the entire assembly typically replaced or just particular sections? So the first question, it is expected to last the life of the engine. So it shouldn't have to be replaced. If something happens and it does need to be replaced, on the 2017 and prior products, you could replace just a section of the catalyst. On the 2018, so all the N products, so the B67N, the ISX12N, and the L9 to N, it's all one unit. So you replace the whole catalyst muffler assembly.
Yeah, I think my experience has been on catalyst replacements is something else damaged the catalyst, either
Exactly.
physically, right? It got hit, or something major happened on the engine side and basically poisoned it. But even then, I've seen them survive some pretty traumatic engine failures, and not have to be replaced.
Yep.
Yeah. So it looks like we had one come in via the chat on what's the expected lifetime in miles on the 12N.
Yeah, I got that one already.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah,
Sorry. Yep. All right. Well, so I was anxious to cut. Well, so since we don't have any more just in the chat at the moment, I will note that we've got a number of fleets now. And it's on the 12G product, but the N is really just an extension of the G, in most, essentially in all ways, other than the emission certification. And we've had a number of fleets that have got 1 million miles, and they've basically rebuilt them at or around 1 million miles. On those engines, they tend to be, well, of course, maybe this is obvious, but they tend to be the sort of highway mile applications, because those are the ones that rack up the miles really quickly. So, it's not and these fleets are following the maintenance guidelines. So just to drill that, into everybody's mind, it makes a huge difference, right? So if we've seen fleets that have had issues on a reactive maintenance basis relatively early, and those that have followed the maintenance guide, get 1 million miles or more before rebuild.
So this is Tim. I wanted to mention, when Martin mentioned that upcoming webinar that would talk about renewables, that's on October the 14th, and folks can register for that the same way they registered for this one. And then the other thing, and this, I don't know if this is something that engine manufacturers don't want to talk about, but I believe that you're certed at the 0.02 gram level on the ends, but actually the actual testing at basically 0.01 or lower, if I recall. Isn't that correct?
That is correct. Yeah. Actual testing, we're below 0.01 on all 3 products, I believe. I can't remember all the cert details, but yes, we're tested at 0.02 at the end of life of an engine. So we certify it to meet that at the end of what testing wise, what would be end of life for an engine. Yeah.
And I don't know whether the folks that are that are listening are in general focused on that certification or not, but that's just an absolutely remarkable emission number that's kind of comparable to grid level emissions of ozone forming emissions. So it's an absolutely remarkable engineering accomplishment.
Yeah, Tim, it's actually lower than the grid level emissions. So yeah, it's right there among the best. We think about zero tailpipe as being the best, but the energy has to come from somewhere. And then, the other thing that, frankly, we're all kind of struggling with is, we're down at the levels of detection, frankly, with these technologies. So, UC Riverside has done some in-use testing, and they've confirmed the numbers, and so we feel really good about the performance of the product from an emission basis. Okay, so we got a couple more here. Are oil additives typically not recommended with the CES 2092 oil?
Yeah, Cummins does not recommend any oil additives. So we don't certify or recommend them beyond oils that meet our standards. So with any oil that meets the 2092 oil spec, if we have that listed on our QuickServe Online website, it would be accepted, but we don't endorse any additional additives being added to an oil.
All right. Okay. And then we've got a follow-up question on valve adjustments. Is the inventory or the interval mandatory?
Yes, for all the platforms, we do recommend adjusting the valves at that interval. This is based on our experience. It may be possible to go further between adjustments, but overall we see that every roughly 1,000 hours or 3,000 hours, depending on which engine platform we're talking about, it should be checked because it does impact drivability, engine performance, and also, most importantly, emissions as well.
Yeah, and I imagine too, if you get into a misfire situation, you run the risk of doing some engine damage.
Potentially.
Yeah,
If you get into an extreme misfire, you start putting a lot of extra fuel into the catalyst, and then you can damage a catalyst, which can get quite pricey.
Yeah. So the simple answer is yes. Yes. Do the valve adjustments on time.
Yeah,
You'll be much happier.
Really, it comes down to maintenance is recommended. We don't own the product, so once it's yours, you can do what you want with it. But if we hit our recommended intervals, we as Cummins are pretty confident that you should have successful operation of the engine.
Okay, so we've got one popped up about the EGR cooler. Is there an improvement to the EGR cooler to have a longer life expectancy on the 12G and the 12N? We have had multiple failures around 100,000 to 120,000 miles.
Yes. I know there has been an improvement on the 12-liter EGR cooler. It was actually a supplier defect, so it wasn't actually a design issue, but there was a batch of them that we're having. We did find some issues. The majority of EGR coolers that we do get back, they don't leak, so there is no trouble found with them. So some of it can be attributed to the troubleshooting around the EGR cooler, replacing it prematurely. But there is a small batch that we're actually having an internal leak, causing the cooler to actually fail.
That reminds me when you said prematurely replacing it. I mean, we've had some instances where folks don't follow troubleshooting trees, and they just basically I kind of like the term swap gnostics, right? Just change things until it's fixed. Cummins offers Quick Serve Online, which is a fantastic tool. I mean, it's just a tremendous tool for troubleshooting our engines. If you don't have Quick Serve, my suggestion is that you get it. It's not free, but it will pay for itself. I think we're down in like 2 to 3 steps to find a failure using Quick Serve as your process. And so it saves a tremendous amount of time and frustration, partly because it lives in the cloud. And so we have the benefit of sharing all of the previous repairs that fit a similar circumstance, and it's always learning. And so you get the benefit of other folks' experiences to facilitate whatever the repair needs to be made. So that's our one plug, Tim, is for fleets to acquire Quick Serve, because it really is a good investment. All right, well we got just a few minutes left. I don't see any more questions that have come up. So if you've got any, now is the time to put them in front of us. But I will offer you that if you think of something, or you had some concern or issue that you think is too much to put into a chat or a Q&A box, there it is on the screen. So I'd like to thank folks for spending the hour with us, and judging from the survey this the beginning of the session, most of you are owners of Cummins equipment. So most importantly, thank you for the business. Thank you for being our customer, and we're here to help wherever we can. So again, if there's something that's going on that doesn't make sense, or you're frustrated, and we will take success stories too. If you really like the product, I'd love to hear that too, as well. But don't feel shy about reaching out. You know, we can't fix something that we're not aware of, and so we'll do our best to address any concerns that you have. So Tim, I'll turn it back to you to kind of close it out.
Thank you very much, Tom and Jason. That was really remarkable. I really appreciate it. You know, tremendous amount of very valuable information conveyed. To remind everybody, we will get this presentation up on our YouTube channel in a few days, so that people can review it if they'd like. And then, of course, this slide here has the emails that are up there that Tom volunteered folks to communicate back with. I wanted to just remind folks, or just briefly mention with the greenhouse gas issue, I did want to just briefly state that, as Tom mentioned, you have an ozone forming emission number that is essentially lower than what you currently experience with the grid and supplied electricity. And because it's not a diesel engine, you do not have any diesel toxic emissions. And with greenhouse gas emissions of renewable natural gas being certified as being net negative, you have an absolutely remarkable opportunity to have a climate action plan for your agency, or a social responsibility plan for your business relative to this engine and the platforms running with these engines. So that's something to be thinking about, and to also be looking to your fleet management associations for information that they would have about where they stand on this particular type of technology. I did want to mention very briefly that we do have upcoming webinars. Today's obviously was the maintenance of the heavy-duty natural gas engines. The one that Martin Mills from US Gain mentioned, future-proofing infrastructure investments, will be coming up on the 14th of October. Renewable natural gas will be part of that. And as you all know, there are issues associated with the introduction of zero emission technologies. And as you look at how you invest in your infrastructure, you'll need to think about how you sort of future-proof investments you make today that will serve you in the future. We will be doing a renewable propane program on October 28th. We'll be doing one about grant writing and finding grant solutions on November 11th. And then on December the 9th, we'll have a do's and don'ts of heavy-duty battery electric vehicle operations. So with that, I want to thank everybody for being with us today. We really appreciate your participation, and we'll close it out at that. So that will do it for today, I guess, unless I see something here. And Chris, do we have anything else we need to do, or can we say that we're all done?
We can say that we're done. I did just remind everybody in the chat to visit cleancitiessacramento.org for a full list of these webinars. In addition, Clean Cities is participating with some local groups on some EV Week activities next week, and those are listed on the website as well. And if you are currently not involved with our Clean Cities organization or one in your city, we really recommend that you get involved and even consider sponsorship for one of your Clean Cities organizations.
Thank you very much. With that, we'll call it quits. Thank you.